I'm Lexa Hillyer, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Lexa Hillyer.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, click on the links in the right-hand sidebar to subscribe to the show. I'd like to thank some sponsors for making today's show possible. First off is George Weir with his book Gem of Sky, Book 1 of the Factions of Sky series. Jim is an orphan living in the floating city of Cirrus. As the dreaded Horn attack, Jim and his friends are scooped up in an adventure of a lifetime when the floating orphanage Janus is destroyed. Not only must Jim, Crowan, and a mech named Goat survive aboard a Horn capital ship, but they must find a way to save each other and all of Sky. In order to do so, Jim and his friends soon find themselves in the crosshairs of the two greatest fleets ever assembled, with a battle coming that may bring nightfall upon Earth forever. But there's a hope and a well-kept secret buried beneath a mountain far below in the land left devastated by the 200-year-old Holocaust. Gem of Sky, Book 1 of the Factions of Sky by George Weir. There's a link to it in the show notes. And thanks to Patricia Gilliam for sponsoring the show. Her book, Out of the Gray, which is the first book in the Henaria series. You really want to pick this up. Aliens, Politics, and Murder. Only the first one is new. This is such a fantastic series, and you can get in on the beginning of the series right now with Book 1, Out of the Gray. The Henaria series is one of my favorite series from one of my favorite writers. You're really going to love what Patricia's doing. Thank you to Patricia for sponsoring the show. Also, at the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Lexa Hillyer on the show with me today. Lexa is the author of several books, and she's also the president, publishing at Glasstown Entertainment, an all-female creative development and production company. And I think we're going to have a great time talking today. Welcome to the show, Lexa.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you. Before we get into talking about all of the stuff that you've got your hands in, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I knew you were going to ask this question. I guess I cheated and listened to some other episodes. And, you know, it's so funny. I was waking up this morning thinking, you know, because I've talked about this a lot, about sort of like imposter syndrome and
Oh, yeah.
you know, how a lot of us writers feel that way. And whenever this question comes up, I always think, oh man, you know, I don't have like the origin story the way some people do, of like, you know, popping out of the womb and sort of knowing I want to be an author. And in fact, you know, as I wrote about in a recent piece for 88 Cups of Tea, I actually didn't even really, as an adult, fully acknowledge at first that I wanted to be an author. So I really had kind of a snail's pace journey getting here. But that said, I was remembering somebody recently dug up a playbill, a program from a musical theater. It was a show of Annie. The musical, when I was 13, and at a community theater. And in my little bio in the program, it said, you know, Lexa Hillyer goes to the local middle school, and you know, she has taken dance classes and piano lessons, and also she enjoys writing. So I thought, okay, there's my proof. I did tell somebody I liked writing at that, you know, at that age. So I guess some little part of me did know, but I think I've always been kind of a late bloomer in a lot of things, and certainly in my career as a writer, that would be no exception. I tend to have these passions for things that are sort of dormant for a very long time, and then all of a sudden I find myself doing it, and then I go, oh, I guess I should put a name on that and make it official. So that's kind of how it happened for me.
Well, I had a guest the other day who wrote her first book at the age of 63, I believe it was. So, you know, I don't think there is any right or wrong answer.
There's no right time.
Yeah. You come to the story, or the story comes to you when it does. Yeah. And you know, I agree with you. Some people, you know, have the story that they were, you know, born with a feather quill, you know, delivering first, and you know, they from the moment, you know, that they were born, they were a writer, and that's really romantic, you know, but that's not everybody's story. And
right. Yeah. Well, I think I've always been surrounded by creativity in general. You know, my mom was for many years a dancer and a dance professor, and my father's a musician and a music professor, and they actually met. They're divorced now, so forget the romance, but they did meet when they were teaching at the same college, and so they met through the musical theater department and stuff. So I kind of have theater and character and performance and stuff like that in my blood from a young age. And so I think when you kind of like a lot of different forms of the arts, it's not always immediate, you know, which path you might take in that. So, you know, I think I was sort of drawn to storytelling and drawn to character and drawn to language. But it just didn't really occur to me what that would look like when I got older. Well,
you know, and it's the reason I asked that question the way I do, a writer or storyteller, because I do believe that people are kind of born with this communication gene, the storytelling gene. Mm-hmm. And some people choose to be a writer, and then some people choose to take that farther and write and publish. But whether you follow it to that end or not, you know, I think there's always hints there, that there's a storytelling element, to your personal story. And some people that manifest on the stage and, or as an actor, or maybe a stand-up comic, or, you know, and then there are those that write books. And, I think, yeah. So, but
and actually, I was going to say, in my career as an editor, I've actually worked with a number of writers, I think, who have come from like a theater background or something like that. And I think that there's, you know, when you come from that background, you're so used to connecting to, you know, usually other people's words, other people's writing, but still kind of inhabiting character. And so I think there's kind of a natural segue. And I think that could even be why at first it made more sense to me, I should be an editor as opposed to a writer, because I sort of thought that would have been my interaction with text in the past, was sort of like, okay, there's a pre-existing text, but how do I get inside it, and how do I feel the way the characters feel? So somehow that led me, I think, more naturally to editing at first. And then as I got braver, I sort of thought, oh, wait, I can actually also kind of create from scratch.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of frustrated actors that become writers also because you get to be in full control, you know, and you're not just using someone else's words, or you're not performing to someone else's direction. You get to be the writer, the director, the performer, kind of all in one. And I think there's something freeing about that for some people that have not had the experience they wanted, maybe.
Right.
But were you a big reader as a kid? Were you a bookworm?
Yeah, I mean, I was. I think I went through phases, but yeah, I mean, I always kind of loved books, and you know, I have kind of some weird early memories of reading, though. Like I had this great first grade teacher who he would like play music in the classroom, and he was very creative, and he didn't really subscribe to some of the traditional curriculum. And so I remember when I went into second grade that we had a much more kind of strict teacher, and anyone who had been in my first grade class the previous year, she kind of put us in this remedial reading section because she wanted us to do the first grade workbook before we could start the second grade workbook with everyone else. Like, we had to play catch up, and we literally sat in the back of the room. And I remember it to this day because in first grade, I had such a joy of discovering reading, that was when I really started to put it together and sit down with all those I Can Read books and things like that. And I just remember, like, I was the kid who always had her hand in the air, being like, I know what vowels are, and stuff like that. And then, so to go from that to then, this in second grade, this teacher sort of putting me in the back of the room, and I think it did make me feel insecure. And I think I always felt like I had this idea that I was a slow reader. I still kind of think that I am a slow reader because I get distracted by a lot of different things, and I think that's also what makes me a good editor, though, because I'm really noticing the words on the page. So sometimes I don't just fly ahead through the story. I'm really paying attention sentence to sentence, sometimes to my own detriment. But I think I had this thought that I was a slow reader or a remedial reader for a while. I'm not going to like blame one teacher, but I kind of think that that's kind of when that thought process started. And then I even remember in elementary school also like having just kind of trying to do my own path with reading. Like we had required, quiet reading time. And I think this was maybe third grade. And all the other girls were reading, like, I forget the series names, but there were all these paperback series. It was kind of in the vein of, Sweet Valley Twins or Babysitter's Club or whatever. It was like books with girls having sleepover parties and things like that, which when you're 8 is sort of aspirational and cool. And I really wanted to read, I was really into A.A. Milne. And Winnie the Pooh sounds really babyish when you're that age, but Milne has all these obviously kind of layered puns and kind of this wittiness to the writing. And so I would always be sort of like giggling to myself reading, these stories of Winnie the Pooh or whatever in the corner of the classroom and thinking, oh, I guess I'm like a weirdo. I don't fit in. But I did have this joy of like wordplay at a young age. And I also remember the school librarian, I think it was probably the same year I tried to check out some Dr. Seuss books, and she said, oh, those are below your reading level. And, again, I don't blame her, and technically that's probably true, but, I just was looking for things that were playing with words, and that's where I was finding it. So I think I had this sort of zigzaggy idea of myself as a reader, and sort of was finding my own kind of off the beaten path way into reading. And then, my love of reading really soared kind of later in middle school and in high school, and just reading all the classics. And my grandmother was always a huge reader, and so she, it's like I remember the summer I turned 15, and she's like, I bequeath you with Thomas Hardy, like now is the summer where you will commence reading Hardy. So that made me feel like some of those big classics were the sort of rite of passage.
Nice. You said that you thought that your path would be as an editor, that would be how you bonded with the words. What was the initial catalyst for you to pursue that? And what did you study in college?
So in college, I went in thinking I was going to do, I was, an undeclared major, like everyone who went to Vassar pretty much. But then I quickly realized all of my classes were in the English department or the theater department. And I had planned to do a double major, but ultimately, even though I did a couple of shows every year, I didn't feel I had time to do justice to a theater thesis and an English thesis. Yeah. So I ultimately just majored in English, and I was focused more on literature. I think I had 2 writing classes in my entire time at Vassar. So most of the time I was doing just literature classes. And I took a short story class, and I remember that I don't know why I'm like all of a sudden all these negative experiences are coming up, but this is like a therapy session. But I remember the short story class. I was very intimidated because this is the first time that I had ever tried to write fiction at all. I hadn't even written it privately to myself. The only kind of writing I did for myself for fun had always been a little bit of diary kind of and letter writing, but mostly poetry. So I sort of thought, well, short stories seem less scary than novels, so let's take this class. And I loved giving feedback on everyone else's stories. I would just really dive in, and I just felt a little clueless about where to start when it came to my own work. And I remember that teacher, again, totally well-meaning, nice guy, but sort of sitting down with me and saying, I remember having a private meeting with him where I said, I just feel like I'm really struggling, and I don't know why. And he said, I just think that when you look at your own work, you should just say to yourself, what would Lexa say? Because your feedback on other people is so useful, if you could just give that feedback to yourself. And I'm sitting there thinking, isn't that like the whole point of why people have editors and teachers, is they can't edit themselves. They can't have that perspective, and writing is so intimate, and it is it's vulnerable and sometimes scary. So I think having somebody else to kind of shine a light at what you're really trying to say is sort of necessary. So, and then the only other writing class I had a year-long poetry class, which I believe that was senior year. And that I loved. And that was also where that professor kind of talked about his experience being published and working with his literary agent and things like that. And it was really only then that I started to think, oh God, I got to figure out what I do after school ends. And this publishing area sounds kind of interesting. So I was really sort of, again, a little naive. I hadn't ever interned at a publishing house or an agency or anything like that before I graduated. But that poetry professor was the one who kind of started talking about the industry and how, there are jobs, over there that you could do. So I think I originally thought maybe I'd be an agent and maybe I'd work with poets. And then when I had a hard time getting hired at an agency, someone kind of said, hey, why don't you check out this open position at HarperCollins? And it was in young adult editing. And then it just kind of opened my mind completely to this whole avenue that a lot of people had almost warned me against editing, because they said, well, if you become an editor, you barely have time to edit, and it's not going to be the creative job that you think. You're going to be just mostly doing business, because you have to negotiate the deals, and you have to, run a bunch of paperwork internally, and, you have to kind of manage all the other branches of what happens to the book, from design and, just all of even like the cost analysis of all the different things that are going to go into the book, from the production department and, of course, marketing. And so you're never going to have time to actually, edit your own books, and, or you will, but, only in the wee hours of the night. And so I've been kind of warned that it was this very transactional job, which, of course, agenting has all those same qualities, but I was naive, and I think it didn't occur to me to actually go out and look at the editing field until I took that one interview, and it was just sort of fate, and I ended up getting that job and just adored it. And I think some of those things about being an editor are true, but not necessarily in a bad way, because it gives you such an eagle-eye view of how the entire process works. And I think it's humbling, and it just makes you realize it's not just as simple as somebody sitting down and jotting off a novel, and then 2 seconds later it's getting placed on shelves. There's a lot that goes on in between, and there's a lot of rejection, and so you get to see all of that stuff, and I think it's really an amazing education. So I was super lucky, I think, to find it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point that you bring out about that editing is more than sitting down with the text and actually editing. What is the life of an editor like on a daily basis?
I mean, it's different every day, and I think it's different if you're talking about my life now versus when I worked at HarperCollins for a few years, and then I worked at Penguin for a few years, and then I started my company, which was originally called Paper Lantern Lit and is now called Glasstown Entertainment. And I started that with my good friend Lauren Oliver, who is also an author. And so the life of an editor in a big publishing house is going to look very different than my life today, in the sense that, you're definitely getting a lot of submissions from agents. And so there's always this growing pile of manuscripts that you need to get to. And I think there are some editors who are kind of lean in on the side of the acquisition side, meaning like they always want to be the first to buy the big hot project. And so they put a lot of energy and focus into courting agents and, making sure they stay on top of their submissions and things like that. And then there are a lot of editors who really lean on the other side, sort of, which is, I have my list, I have a lot of good books. If something else great comes my way, okay, that's exciting, but really putting their muscle into just the editing process and making the books as strong as they can be and developing their relationships with their authors. And then there are other editors who try and put most of their focus on sort of persuading the rest of the publishing house to really make their books the sort of important ones, because you're always kind of fighting for attention. So I don't think people always necessarily realize how many hundreds of books are coming out every year from every publisher. And every editor probably has a list of anywhere from, 3 to 10 projects that they're working on that year. Just trying to get any of your books get as much attention as they can and get the marketing support they need it requires a lot of energy and a lot of effort. So I think different editors kind of have different styles, but everybody's got to wear a million hats at once because, like I said, you're sort of liaising with all of these internal departments. You're running up and down the stairs talking to, the copy editors who have queries, and the production team who is saying, we thought we were going to do this cool header or this cool feature on the cover, but turns out it's too expensive, and can you talk to the design team? And so you're kind of like running back and forth, getting approvals from people and negotiating and trying to represent what the book really is and what's best for it, and then of course what the author wants, and so there's a lot of different hats you're wearing. So the rumors are kind of true that often you don't have a lot of quiet time at your desk to just sit and read a manuscript, let alone read the competition out there. So I think a lot of editors are very stressed in terms of their reading time being so limited and their editing time being so limited. So there's a lot of like long, when I used to work at Harper and Penguin, long, Sundays just sitting in a diner kind of with a printout of the manuscript in front of me and a red pen and like sort of doing the actual work of being an editor. And, now I work for myself, and, with Glasstown, we are a team of 7. The New York team is 5. Well, actually 4, but we have someone new joining us next month, so it'll be 5 again. And since we don't work, within a big publishing house, we don't have to manage all of those many little things that go on all day, and we can avoid a lot of that kind of bureaucracy and administrative energy. So it's nice because I can spend a lot of my day doing creative, which is great, but it's sometimes that's exhausting in its own way, right? Because your brain is just constantly on, and you're leaping from world to world to world as you go from these different books that are all in different stages, and so what we do at Glasstown is, we work with authors very early on in the process. We're basically coming up with concepts that we think, are big and juicy and exciting, but that also allow us to talk about, issues that are important to us, in fun and accessible ways. And then, we try very early on to find writers who want to work with us on these ideas. So that's that's why we're sort of, even before we started producing on the film and TV side, we always kind of called ourselves book producers, because we're like, well, we're kind of putting together all the strands. So we're constantly working on things from the very, very early stage of like, what even is the idea? And how could it possibly take shape from kind of a murky sort of area or a sense of an idea or a sense of a character into, a full-blown plot. And then sometimes we're working in sort of the mid-stage where we've got an author attached, they're writing away, but we've hit a snag in the plot, and now we have to kind of come together to unravel it, to much further down the process where, we're participating in trying to support the book as it gets ready to be published and things like that. So we do have our hands in the process from the very beginning to, I say quote unquote the end, because there's really no end once the book is out there, hopefully. But the way that we're doing that is much more the creative side of it, of brainstorming solutions to things and coming up with ideas. So it's really fun, and I feel so privileged and lucky to be able to do that. but I always sort of warn people when they want to work with us, like it doesn't mean it's an easier job, than working in a publishing house, because you may not have as many meetings, but you really are kind of, your brain is on all the time. And I think, it's nice sometimes to just have a break and have meetings or have, just emails and be arguing over the unit cost of the specs on this, cover or whatever, to kind of take a break from some of that creative energy. So, but I love it.
Well, and looking at the webpage for Glasstown, there are some amazing books and writers represented there, and a few that we've had on the show, Sarah Holland, Alma Katsu, some just amazing stuff you guys are doing.
Thank you.
So this is sort of a collaborative, process, it sounds like. And I love the idea of book producers. And when you were talking earlier, I was kind of thinking, it sounds like that you really like to play the role, that like a producer, of music does. If a band goes in and wants to record, it's them, but the producer has their own, kind of flavor and style that kind of gets stamped onto the music. It's still the artist, but there's a certain feel to it that people bring, as playing that role, and it really sounds like you guys are doing something similar to that. And then, what about the film and TV side that you mentioned? What are you guys doing in that space?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that analogy. Since music is one thing we certainly don't do over here. So, and I think
a lot of creative,
right.
Yeah, a lot of creative pursuits kind of bleed over from, one to the other.
Yeah.
Though. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's another one of those things where I think a lot of people who don't know about the music industry probably don't know that that's how it works, right? So they hear an album and they think, oh, there's variety in the sound of this artist's work, but that it's, it's just only the artist's creative vision, and they're not realizing that, artists will collaborate with a bunch of different producers or different producers for different albums or whatever it is. And you're absolutely right that the producers have a lot of creative involvement in terms of, like, they have their own they have their ideas and formulas about what they think works, right? But then they also have their creative input of how they want to be fresh and different. And I think your use of the word collaborative that's like my favorite word. I'm just one of those people, I know there's like a lot of different types of learners, right? Like some people learn better by listening, or learn better by reading, or learn better by, having their hands on, instruction. And I don't know if there was a category for sort of collaborative learning or whatever, collaborative success, but I just feel like I realized that my style for how I can achieve the most, whether it's from a business standpoint or from a creative standpoint, is through collaboration. It's just how my brain works. And I think it's how a lot of people's brain works. And again, like you said, how a lot of industries work behind the scenes and people don't realize it. So, but moving on to the other part of your question, with TV and film. So yeah, we launched, as I said, in the ancient days of 2010 as Paper Lantern Lit. And at the time, we were solely a book company. That was my background, and that was, my business partner's background as well. And so at the time, our relationship to film and TV was sort of a passive one, right? Like you occasionally go out there and sort of shop around the books that you have going on and say, hey, does anyone want to maybe option one of these? What do you think? Which is fine and great, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we always sort of secretly were saying to ourselves, whenever we're working this early on, on a series, let's say, or even on a standalone, we have so many other ideas that we talk about with the author or that we talk about with our team that don't make it onto the page, right? Because like any author, you have your pages and pages of background notes on the family and the characters and the world and all of that stuff. And so we were always thinking, we want to be able to tell a million different side stories off of this one story. And, we're always falling in love with some side character that, we know isn't going to have enough time on the page. Or again, with a series, we're always sort of thinking, oh my God, There are so many different subplots here that, if we had all the time or all the books in the world, we would do more with all these different subplots. And so we kept thinking, gosh, we're so perfect to collaborate with like TV creators, because we could sit there and go, okay, well, we could figure out an entire, sort of series arc or season arc based on this idea. We already have so many of those notes and thoughts before the book is even out into the world. So we knew we had this kind of, in some ways, unique stance. And at the same time, because we aren't the authors ourselves, when we're talking about Glasstown or Paper Lantern Lit books, we also have enough distance that, sometimes authors have a really hard time with adaptation of their own work, because similar to editorial, it's just hard to get distance from your own work, of course. So we were like, well, we're in this perfect position where we can get a little more distance, because we do feel like all of the books that we do are babies, but also we kind of, we've been in the business long enough, we kind of stand back and say, okay, well, we loved this for the book, but we can totally understand how it could be completely reinterpreted for film or television. Sometimes we felt we could be sort of less precious about certain elements, so we were like, oh my God, we're just in such a perfect position to be able to adapt material. And also, I think at the end of the day, I'm deeply passionate about words. Going back to that librarian who said Dr. Seuss was beneath my reading level or whatever. And I'm like, this guy's making up words. How many other authors for 8-year-olds are making up new words? And, that's what I wanted to be part of. I love language. So of course I'm drawn to the format of the book. But that said, like you said, it's the storytelling gene, and that doesn't necessarily come out of the womb as in the form of, paper and ink. It can take any form. And so I think we always felt a little bit like we wanted to be able to tell story in whatever way we could reach people, and whatever way best served the story, or best served, the people who we wanted to get the story to. So eventually, and it took a long time, and we started to be building more partnerships as Paper Lantern Lit. And I think we started to realize, we really just want to actually be producing TV and film. I think the best way to be clear of how we can be creative partners is to actually start doing that. And so much like starting a business from scratch, which we did with Paper Lantern Lit, we started the LA office from scratch really only about 1.5 years ago, and that's when we rebranded to Glasstown Entertainment. And we kind of said, okay, we have a good track record as Paper Lantern, but let's start fresh, and let's start meeting people as producers, and let's start saying, okay, we've already created a treatment, we've already reached out to certain screenwriters, we've already started making attachments and things like that. So we basically just started doing the work of producers. And so now Lauren Oliver kind of runs that whole branch, and we have, it's really only one other girl who reports to her there, but in the past little over a year, we've made huge strides there, and it's been super exciting, because it is so empowering. It's the same thing we were doing on this side, where it's like the world is our oyster. If there's writers we want to work with, let's reach out and see if they want to work with us. And instead of kind of waiting and hoping that people find the books we're doing and see the work we're doing, instead we can go out and make those connections ourselves. And so it's not so much about really having control over the creative process. Of course, it's partly that. It's just being part of the creative process, right? That's what's exciting to us, is being involved and being part of it. We don't have to have the ultimate say on things, and that's not why we want to be doing it. But we want to be part of it because we know we have a lot to contribute. And then also it's just getting it done, right? Because there's so much, I think, that, LA and New York don't really kind of speak the same language sometimes. And so a lot of authors, I think, have had the experience of having their books sort of optioned and then wait and see what happens. Or have their book shopped around but don't really understand, the mentality of what people are thinking when they're looking at it. And so I think we can just kind of bridge that gap more. And again, since we have legs out there now, we can really just hit the pavement and say, okay, we're going to do whatever it takes to get this show done, meaning we're going to court writers, or we're going to talk to directors, or we're going to think about talent that could fit it, and we're just going to keep trying to work those connections until we can make those shows happen. So it's just very satisfying to put your muscle into it rather than kind of waiting and hoping and seeing. And, again, kind of the other thing about LA is it's weird. Like New York, has a rep for people being less like friendly, right? But New York tells you like it is. LA, they say yes to everything. They smile in your face. They're like, oh my God, come stay in my Malibu house next time you're here. Everybody's so nice in LA and so beautiful and so smiley, and then you leave and you're like, wait, what about that Malibu house? Did you say, then you don't hear from them again, or they say, oh, well, the studio wasn't interested or whatever. It's like, everybody is overly nice, but you're never really sure what they mean, and at least you kind of know where people stand in New York. So I think that's the thing that at first we really had to kind of weather. And I think it helps to be on the ground there. So that was a long answer, but
well, no, and it's so refreshing to see folks in the publishing industry that are actually innovating and pushing things forward. Publishing kind of has this reputation for being a few years behind everything. Kindles came out and ebooks really became a thing. Years ago, people used to sell PDFs on their website and call that an ebook. And it might be, but there's no convenient way to read that. But then Kindles came out and just boom, and the publishing industry fought that, until finally they embraced it, it's so cool to see forward thinking people that are actually, pushing it, ahead of things. So, I love what you guys are doing. That is fantastic. Let's talk about your books for just a minute. When did you decide to write your first novel, and was your publishing company already established? Did you want to branch out as a publisher yourself, or as a writer first?
I did actually write. So, let's see, what was the order of everything? I wrote a book pseudonymously when I was 27, and it was just sort of like a writer for hire type of thing. It was like a former colleague who kind of thought, hey, we need somebody to put out this sort of like summer romance paperback thing quickly, and like, Lexa, have you ever thought about writing? And it was one of those things that, like, if you're a writer just pounding the pavement, desperately trying to get representation and trying to get published, it's like mind-boggling to think someone could call you and ask you to write something. But, when you're in the industry, of course, it's different. And so I was lucky to have access to things like that. So I was sort of nudged into attempting to write a novel. And I'm just I tend to be kind of a yes person, even though I'm also very timid. So I'll be sort of freaked out, but I'll be like, well, it seems like I should just say yes and then figure it all out later. So, I did get to cut my teeth on something, but without putting my name on it. So I could kind of like hide behind it a little bit, which, for better or for worse, right? I'm sure I could have handled it differently, and I could have gotten out in front of it and whatever, but I am just grateful for that as a learning experience. And at the same time as I was writing that, I was still working at Penguin at the time, and I was also looking at MFA programs for poetry. So then I did my MFA in poetry. And then when I was graduating from that was 2010. So around like the second year of the MFA, I was still working at Penguin because I did my MFA remotely. Like I did, what do you call it? I'm now blanking on what they call the sort of long distance, low residency. Anyway, so I was doing a low residency MFA and kind of juggling a lot. Like I just finished writing the pseudonymous book, and then I'm like working on, this poetry thesis and everything at the same time that I'm working a full-time job at Penguin. And then at the same time that I'm doing all of that, I'm having these conversations with Lauren Oliver, who had, by that point, we met at Penguin, but she had left and was focusing on her writing. And that's when we came up with the idea for Paper Lantern Lit. So then things kind of all collided at once, because I remember we launched the company in May of 2010. We'd been working on it probably for 6 to 8 months leading up to that, just kind of preparatory stuff to figure out, who and what we were going to be. But we launched officially in May 2010, and I think I graduated from my MFA program in June or July of 2010. So in a weird way, I was mostly focusing on Paper Lantern Lit, but then also sort of thinking, okay, I want to really use what I had already started in my MFA and push myself to do something with this poetry. So I did, and I entered a zillion contests and eventually I won a contest from this tiny publisher in Lake Tahoe. They only publish, I think, one book of poetry a year, and she's since sold to somebody else, so I don't know what's happening with them now. But anyway, so I happened to win this one year, and I think it was like, a grand prize of like $500 or something, plus a plane ticket to Tahoe or whatever. So, this is not like the big moment, the big win or whatever, the big cash cow or anything like that. But, but they agreed to publish the book. So I published my first book of poetry, and that was, I think, around 2012. So by the time that came out, we had already gotten Paper Lantern Lit really running by then. So I then had some books in the world. I had some experience. I wasn't like a complete novice. But even still, like, this just shows you how kind of timid and self-conscious I can be. Like, even with all of those things, those credentials and those experiences, I was still just like, nope, not going to write a novel with my own name on it. I don't know what it would be, and I wouldn't want all of the authors that I've worked with as an editor to be like somehow disappointed in me because I'm trying to hold them to certain standards in their writing, and then what if I don't, live up to those things? I just put myself in this position where I felt like, oh my God, I have to be like this shining example because I already had a career in editing, and like I didn't want to jeopardize that, and I was just so self-conscious about everything. And I remember I had an idea for a book, and I remember writing like a prologue, and I sent it to my mom, and she was like, great, honey, keep writing. And I'm like, oh, that's such a mom thing to say. Does that mean she hated it? And then I sat my husband down and had him read it, and he kind of read it, and then he was sort of quiet, and then he went, it's good. And I literally, I kid you not, burst into tears. I was just like, it's good? With an upward inflection. Like, I was just devastated. I threw myself down on the bed. Like, I sound like a teenager, but I was genuinely just like, I can't do this. I give up. If this is how hard it is to write a prologue, I'm not doing it. Like, I'm not ready.
Do you people understand I have an MFA?
Yeah.
So funny. Yeah.
So, I just, I was just very insecure. And so I think I didn't really get the chutzpah to write my first novel with my own name on it until I think I sold it a year after all of that happened. I think I sold it in 2013. It came out in 2015. And I remember that because I was hugely pregnant. I was due to give birth like 2 weeks after the book came out. So for some reason, I keep doing all of these book-related milestones at the same time that I'm having like personal milestones, and it makes things very annoying. But anyway, yeah, I think I sold Proof of Forever in 2013, and I think I had just been thinking about these 4 girls and what their story was, and I was actually thinking about doing the book for Paper Lantern Lit and thinking about who we would get to write it or whatever. And it was very early stages. And I was sort of, as we often have to do when we are coming up with ideas for our company, you have to kind of feel your way into the characters and into the world before you understand what it is well enough to then start talking to other people about what it is. So I was sort of having that meditative time with this idea, and it was just very, very kind of unhatched. And I just started connecting with all the 4 girls and finding myself in each one of them. Proof of Forever is sort of a friendship story about 4 girls who have grown apart, but they get this, kind of unlikely opportunity essentially to go back in time to the summer they were 15. They're 17 now. And sort of like the beginning of the end of their friendship, and they sort of believe they have a second chance to maybe mend things or find out what went wrong. And anyway, so I think once I just sort of realized, wait, all of these characters are a piece of me, it didn't feel right for anyone else to do it. And suddenly I thought, oh, I think this is my first book. And, it just felt very Lexa. I don't really know how else to describe it. It captured a lot of the feelings that I have about being a teen, both the sort of the romanticized feelings, but also the sort of angsty, more painful feelings. And So yeah, it was a little bit inexplicable. I think things just happen at the time that they happen because you're ready. And I think there's a lot of work. Like I said before, there's a lot of sort of dormant passion or a lot of work that you're doing that you may not see or that may not seem to bear fruit. And then all of a sudden, when you're ready, it seems to burst forth out of nowhere. But in fact, it is the result of all of that hard work that didn't seem to be paying off before, that there is a connection. But I think in the moment, sometimes it feels spontaneous. It feels like, oh my God, I went from not being able to write a book to being able to write a book. And not only that, but, like I wrote the first 80 pages in like a month or a few weeks or something like that. And it just it flowed very quickly. So, again, I think when you hear those stories, it's important to remember. We used to say this in poetry too. Sometimes your best poems, it's so frustrating because sometimes your best poems are just, I don't know, you wake up with a bad hangover on a Sunday morning or whatever, and you write something that seems like nonsense, and then you read it later and say, oh my God, I think this is maybe good, or you kind of, you're gathering together the poems that you wrote, to turn into your professor or something like that. And you've been working on them for months. And then you kind of think, oh, I don't have enough. I better write one more right now really quickly before it's due or something like that. And then the professor goes, oh, this last one really had something to it. And you're like, wait a second. I feel like I cheated. It's the thing that I kind of wrote without any effort at all that people respond to or that they say is good or that just feels right. And what we would always say in poetry is, all of the bad poems you wrote have earned you that easy poem because it wasn't actually easy. It was all of the stumbling and all of the failure and all of the effort to articulate yourself and not getting it right that then, your muscles, your sort of creative muscles are so primed that then when you can kind of let your walls down, when you least expect it, the good work comes out and it does sort of in the moment feel surprising. I think that's sort of why it's like the shower moment people talk about where you're sitting in front of your computer all day and you can't solve a problem. And then, at night you take a shower and all of a sudden like a million genius ideas flow into your brain and you're like, it can't be the shampoo. Like why am I all of a sudden figuring it out now and I have no place to write it down? And I really think it is. It's that like, I think there's real brain science to it too. I mean, I'm no neuroscientist, so I can't tell you, but I think there is something about exhausting the sort of logic-driven side of your brain that then it has to try every avenue. And then once that's tired and once that's done, then the sort of associative creative side of your brain goes, all right, well, you tried everything. So how about this random idea? And it kind of frees you up to think about something from a whole new angle. Anyway, once again, I've rambled down a long road, but the answer to your question is, I think I was 33 when I sold Proof of Forever. I was 35 when it came out, and it was a strange journey getting there.
Yeah. And your new series, the Spindle Fire series, began with the book Spindle Fire, and the new book is Winter Glass, a follow-up to that. Again, sort of a YA book, but this time going from modern setting to a fantastical fairy tale takeoff sort of thing. What was first off, why do you think you love writing in the YA space? And then from there, how is it different for you shifting gears from a story of four girls to this take on a familiar feeling story to the rest of us, but in a fantasy setting? Right.
Well, you should know better by now in this conversation to ask me a two-part question. Answers are already too long.
Look, I'm pulling myself back. Usually I ask 20 questions at once, so I'm pacing myself.
I appreciate your patience. I think, so let's see. There's the second part of the question is the transition between categories. And sorry, wait, what the first part of your question?
Yeah, why do you love writing in the YA?
Why YA? Right, exactly, of course. So, I mean, the young adult side of it, I guess the attempt to be short and sweet with it is I do just think that the teen years are like a super transformative time in life, physically and emotionally and just in terms of life experience. They're really the years where you change from a child to an adult. And, that sounds simplistic, but so much is happening in terms of rapid fire change that I think it's just a really, really fruitful, rich period of life to mine for story. And it allows everything to feel heightened and intense at all times in a way that as an adult, that's not always the case. So I think that when you are creating good fiction, it's just a place that's rife with drama and excitement and pain and ups and downs. So it's a great place to start, I think, as a creator. So I would say that's the biggest reason why young adults. And I also think that there's, because it has sort of historically been considered, I guess I want to say like a more commercially driven, more entertainment driven category. You know what I mean? Like, it didn't start out as being considered literary, even though obviously there's incredible amount of literary work that's going on, and that always has been going on. It wasn't kind of portrayed that way or marketed that way at all. And so for that reason, there's a liberation in the sense of like, the focus is on the kinds of stories you're telling, and there's kind of an expectation of having fun with it and being entertaining. So again, not all books have to be fun or entertaining by any means, but I just feel like YA is a category where you can just kind of do whatever you want. Like there's just and where big storytelling, if that makes sense, is invited and encouraged. So it's not to say that I don't like working on adult books too, because I do, and I think there's a lot that you can explore in terms of psychological subtlety and kind of moral grayness that you can't always get away with as much in YA. So there's limitations, I think, to both sides. But I fell in love with YA for all of those reasons, and I think most YA writers probably have to force themselves to admit that there is some part of them, the teenage self, that still carries around the freshness of how those emotions felt when you first experienced them. So even if, you're married and you're kind of like, romance isn't necessarily the top of your weekly agenda or whatever, it's more like getting the kids' lunches packed or whatever. When you think about romance, what you think about is that feeling you had when you were 15 and you were falling in love with a character in a book, or, when you were 13 and having your first crush, or, things like that. Right. So I think that, a lot of us, not just writers or editors, a lot of us carry those associations. Like when we really tap into what does that emotion mean to us, we tap into sort of our earliest iteration of it. Same thing with pain and betrayal and loss. It's like those things that happened to us when we were young and that really, found a place inside us and have lived inside us since and become part of who we are. So in that sense, I think that's also why YA appeals to more than just teens. But those are the reasons why I'm drawn to it in particular. And in terms of the transition, part 2, from contemporary to fantasy, this just goes to show that I didn't plan to be an author and didn't map out what my brand was going to be or anything like that. I could have been really savvy and strategic about, how I wanted to leave my mark on the world or how I wanted to set up for having this career or whatever. But I was not, despite working in this industry for a long time, I was still like any other writer. I was just writing what I felt was next for me. And I do tend to be a person where, again, I think even after Proof of Forever, I was still sort of like, okay, I'm an author because I wrote a book, and now you all know I wrote it because my name's on it. But I'm not an author like all the rest of you who are doing this for your career, even though I was doing it for my career. But somehow I just was sort of again, it's an imposter syndrome of well, am I really an author? And so I think I didn't have a plan for the next book, and I was sort of playing around with another contemporary, which by the way I'm still playing around with, which had to do with sisters, but it was a little darker. I mean, Proof of Forever has its darkness, which I won't give away any spoilers, but things do take a turn. But my second idea was definitely darker, but still dealing with these ideas of female relationships and and love and loss and growing pains and things like that. And then as I was working on that contemporary, I just got this crazy idea. Well, so actually the second contemporary, which I'm still working on now, because I kind of set it aside once I came up with Spindle Fire, but it has themes of fairy tales woven through, but it is very grounded. And I had this idea of Sleeping Beauty kind of just as a motif, and because there's this sort of like seemingly perfect, beautiful older sister, and something terrible happens to her at the beginning of the book, and it's kind of around, what secrets she had and what people sort of projected onto her, and it kind of reminded me of Sleeping Beauty and this idea of this passive, sort of princess-like figure who's revered by other people but has no real selfhood in the story. It's all about the conjecture of everybody running around like crazy, around, reacting to her, and she's sort of objectified. So I was thinking a lot about that and how women are objectified in general, and just got this idea of what if Sleeping Beauty isn't just passively sleeping? What if, we get to sort of see what she's dreaming, and what if in fact it's not just a dream? What if in fact she's sort of transported? So the rest of the world thinks she's asleep, but actually she's transported into this sort of dream world. And in order to make that make sense, I was like, well, I guess the dream world would be somehow related to the magic of those fairies. And so it just started sort of spiraling from there into this whole rich idea of like a fantasy dream world within a medieval fantasy world, like a more traditional medieval fantasy world. And I'm like, ooh, fantasy within a fantasy? Where do I sign? Even though literally I've never written a fantasy novel before. Like, I don't know. I just thought, let's just bite off way more than I can chew and see what happens. So once again, kind of throwing myself headlong into something that I really did not feel prepared for. Once again, huge imposter syndrome, even like to the point of being on panels after the book was out, and I was really proud of the book, but, talking with all of these fantasy authors who knew they were going to be fantasy authors their whole lives, or had published, multiple fantasy series before and really know the genre like the back of their hand. And I had always been a little bit more of a contempt girl, like as an editor and as a reader. I mean, there were certain moments of loving fantasy when I was younger, but I never thought I would be a fantasy writer at all. So I felt once again like a complete fraud and was very nervous and distressed about how I would be able to do it. But at the same time, again, I think, I don't know, it's like you said, that storytelling gene, like when you have this idea and you want to say it and it feels like it's your voice, you kind of have to be true to that. And so I just tried to be true to myself and say, I'm going to honor the sort of conventions of this genre as much as I know how to, or as much as makes sense to, but I'm really just going to find my way through this story for what it is, and learn how to world build by hand. I mean, I had done world building with other authors, of course, as an editor, but really learn how to do it myself for my own book, and just follow the path of these two female heroines. And so, and when I say two, for those who don't know anything about Spindle Fire, so the other innovation other than Aurora going into a dream world was giving her a sister. And I did another interview where someone used the phrase, we're in a post-Frozen world. And I love that. And I think that's definitely true. That definitely was a huge influence. Like, okay, suddenly it's like a big commercial concept to talk about sisters. I mean, I've been wanting to talk about sisters forever, and I already have been. And all of my favorite books were about sisters. But suddenly it was like a cool thing to do, Suddenly, like it didn't have to just be a romance or a love triangle or, a vampire love triangle or whatever, you know what I mean? And so I felt really just very driven and inspired to tell this story of sisterhood, but within this fairy tale setting. And I think, again, it's also my love of taking existing ideas, whether they are other people's books that I'm editing, whether it's somebody else's play that I'm acting in, or whether in this case it's a fairy tale that I'm riffing off of. Taking pre-existing material and then using that and molding it and adding my own creative stamp to it. I think it's just, it goes to that collaborative nature of my brain where, like, the more you give me to work with, the more I then bring to the table. Sometimes with a blank slate, I feel a little bit like I don't know where to start, and I don't know which, there's a million different ways you can always take things. So to have a framework, a pre-existing framework to play within, actually kind of sets my creative mind free, and I have much more fun. So I think that is part of what gave me the confidence to do what otherwise was a very challenging thing for me. And I'm really proud that I did this fantasy duology. In fact, I'm so proud of, Winterglass. I feel definitely that's the sequel, and that's when it came out in April. And it's definitely by far the book I'm most proud of. And I think I'm sure most authors feel that way, but it's definitely a really good feeling to think that you're growing with every book, and really that you just, when you started it or when you were in the middle of it, you really did not believe mathematically that it was going to happen. You didn't think you were going to get to the end. You didn't think you were going to be able to solve it, and then you did. It's such a triumphant feeling. There's so much misery in having a book out, and so much stress and vulnerability, and not getting the things you wanted, or having bad reviews, or whatever it is. There's so much that's hard about it. It seems like a dream when you're not published, but it's actually it can be really hard and uncomfortable. And, the only way through is to focus, on the next work, and also to remember that sense of achievement, because sometimes that feeling is really short-lived. But I do feel that way about getting through fantasy, and I feel a little, to be honest, mixed about going back to this contemporary idea that I had before, because I don't know, it's weird to kind of flip-flop in between genres. But like I said, you kind of have to do what you have to do, and so I'm trying to just be in the moment with whatever the next book is. Yeah.
And Spindle Fire and Winterglass are absolutely phenomenal. I'm recommending it to fans of fantasy. It's kind of across the board. Listeners to the show here will be familiar with Kendare Blake's series, the Three Dark Crowns, and it's reminiscent of that, and this kind of modern, darker take on fantasy fairy tales, and it's absolutely brilliant. I love it. I hope you stay in this vein and write more, because I think you're doing some phenomenal stuff there. Lexa, this has been a crazy fast hour, but if people are just learning about you and want to find out more about what you do as a writer, and about what you're doing with Glasstown, where can people find you, and how can they connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on the interwebs. I have a website. It's just lexahillyer.com. Glasstown Entertainment also has a website, which is just glasstownentertainment.com. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and so is Glasstown. My Instagram handle is Proof of Lex, and my Twitter is Lexa_Hillyer. I spend more time on Instagram than on Twitter. So in terms of, responding more quickly to comments and things like that, that's probably the better way to connect directly.
Well, Instagram's where all the good vibes are.
Instagram's yeah, exactly. But if you want all the news on Glasstown, like recent deals or things like that, then the Glasstown Entertainment, I think it's just Glasstown Ent on Twitter is also good. And then Glasstown also has a newsletter, which we need to revamp a little bit, but that's a great thing to subscribe to, just so you can get a little bit of a broader sense of what we're up to, because you're not always going to see it just on social or on the website. There's always a million little things going on. And I'd love to hear from people. And thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your nice words on the books.
Yeah, Lexa, thank you for coming on and taking time to share your story. We're going to send everybody to pick up the books and to send them to your website. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The brutes of the Andersonville Prison Hospital have moved me to the dead room, or so it has come to be known. None so domiciled have yet left this place. We receive only the smallest rations and only cursory care, to reduce our odors and spare the nostrils of our keepers. The good Christians of the Confederacy do not see any need to provide comfort to those who will soon sleep soundly enough underground. You must know, at least, how your father came to such an end. At Doctortown, Kilpatrick entrusted me with the conquest of a railroad trestle, and my bummers, my demolition team, acquitted themselves admirably thanks to my ingenuity with powder. We successfully destroyed the trestle work past Morgan's Lake. This would prove to be my entire contribution to the war. Federal troops were unable to capture the bridge or overcome the enemy's battery. Kilpatrick withdrew, and my bummers and I found ourselves on the wrong side of the Altamaha River, behind the enemy line with no hope of reaching our encampment. Rebels accosted us, taking our remaining supplies. We escaped and headed south, hoping by a long march to reach Seymour's forces in Jacksonville, but we encountered other rebel encampments at Jessup. 4 of my men were lost to gunfire. We marched west, then south again, barely evading capture. We had no choice but to brave the great swamp Okefenokee. Oh, on and on it goes, in every direction, endlessly. We trudged through miles of grasping mud and noxious rot, pursued by hunger and the mosquito, scratching at our arms and faces until all our skin was scourged. We lived off alligator meat at first, then nothing at all. My men grew mutinous, blamed me for all their misfortunes, threatened to throw me in a sack, weigh me down with stones, and sink my body. Yet was I not equally hungry? Did I not starve? I grew weary of their endless insubordination and contempt. Finally, they took hold of me and swore they would hang me by the neck for leading them to ruin. They were 5 in number, younger than I and more muscular. I was no match for them physically. They laid their hands on me, and I burned them. I burned those men. The flame rose from me as from a volcano, stripping the skin from those boys, blackening their faces, roasting their flesh. And let this be my final ghastly confession. I feasted that night, feasted on the meat of my prospective murderers. And that is how I survived. I staggered alone from that swamp, a mad thing, fueled by outrage and guilt. I saw an encampment of rebel soldiers and surrendered myself gladly. They say in Andersonville prison all men are brothers, equal in filth, equal in terror, equal in ruin. Yet I feel I may claim some small distinction, at least. For I am surely damned to a greater extent than any here.